Okay, so let's look at VJC EQ5. So this question here, we're given a preamble that talks about different governments implementing different policies to reduce the country's current account deficit. So US, they use protectionist measure like your tariffs. Other governments choose to adopt tight fiscal policy or supply side policy. Okay, so down here, what we have, all right, we have a question that asks about your current account deficit. Okay, the factors that are likely to cause a current account deficit. The other one is about appropriateness of measures a government could adopt to alleviate a current account deficit. So these are related to your BOP topic lah. Okay, in terms of the content that we're going to cover. All right, so when we talk about current account, what constitutes your current account? When we talk about current account, what constitutes your current account? Current account? X minus M, which is part of your balance of trade, which is under your goods and services balance lah. Okay, so your current account here, you have your X minus M. Okay, your net exports. All right, another name for net exports is your balance of trade, which sometimes is what you see. Okay. Under your current account, this is known as your goods and services balance. Is that the only component of your current account? You have your income balance. What else? Unilateral transfers. Okay, so for the sake of this question, we will not talk so much about income balance and unilateral transfer, simply because they are not so easily adjustable by your government policies, unlike your X minus M. Okay, these two are not as easily manipulated lah. It's really this part here that you can actually go about adjusting through your various policies. Okay, so for this question, we are going to talk about that cause a deficit here. So deficit here, what does this mean about your X minus M position? Is it positive? Is it zero, or is it negative? This is actually negative, which suggests to us that your X is actually lesser than your M. So what are some reasons as to why export revenue is smaller than your import expenditure? What are some possible reasons behind that, the factors? So what is the first factor you can think of? Roslyn? What is the first factor that you have that can help us to explain why there's a deficit on your current account? Change in prices of. So this one has got to do with what? Relative inflation rate? Because you're talking about change in prices, right? But why do you look so unclear or unsure? Correct or not? Relative inflation rate. How does this relative inflation rate affect your X minus M? How does relative inflation rate affect your X minus M? So if we say that there's a deficit, all Right? How does this relative inflation rate affect? So when we talk about relative inflation rate, what do we mean? We are comparing domestic inflation rate to what? To overseas inflation rate, to inflation rate in other countries. So in what kind of instance, all right, is it domestic inflation rate is smaller, or is it the case where it's greater, that we will see a deficit in your BOT? In which case will we see a deficit on your BOT? Domestic inflation rate, greater or smaller? Are we? You don't know what I'm talking about, you don't know. Because when we talk about what causes a balance of trade deficit, okay, we are talking about your X being less than your M. Right or not? So what will lead to this situation? Domestic inflation rate higher or smaller than your overseas inflation rate? Will we see this case here? Domestic inflation rate to be higher. So the case whereby you have higher relative inflation rate. When you have higher relative inflation rate, this means that your price of exports become less price competitive. All right, and that's why your export revenue is likely to decrease. Because your country has a relatively higher inflation rate, so this makes imports from other countries relatively cheaper. And your domestic consumers will therefore increase their demand for imports, which are a substitute of your domestically produced goods, assuming that they are substitutes. So that's why your M actually increased, your X actually decreased, such that your X becomes smaller than your M. Are we clear on this? Because you all don't seem to know what I'm talking about. All right, and this is not the first tutorial on this actually. All right, so relative inflation rate is just one way it can impact. What's another one? What about exchange rate? When we appreciate or when we depreciate? When we appreciate. When we appreciate, exports become relatively more expensive in foreign currency. I mentioned you need to write that whole chunk that I just said. Exports become relatively more expensive in foreign currency. Imports become relatively cheaper in domestic currency. You need to have that whole chunk again. So what happens? Assuming Marshall-Lerner condition, this appreciation will lead to a fall in your X minus M. And assuming your X minus M was originally at equilibrium, this fall in your X minus M would move your balance of trade position to a deficit. All right, and since assume everything else stays constant, all right, this balance of trade deficit will lead to the current account deficit that we see. Okay, so appreciation here. What else? We talk about at least three, then I will show you the answer. What's the third one? What's the third one? Income. So do we just say income? This one actually you have to talk about relative income as well. Okay, what do we mean by relative income? So income, I think, when there's a global economic growth, when there's growth that is spread across around the world, all right, your country see a much faster rate of growth compared to other countries. That's one way of looking at this. This is relative income lah. Another way is just talking about how income in your country actually increase. So if your incomes are increasing and assume everything else stays constant, what will happen? Sorry? You will consume more imports because imports are income induced. When you earn higher income, higher purchasing power, you will buy more imports as a result of that. All right, and with that, your import expenditure will increase. Okay, assume ceteris paribus, your x minus m decreases, assuming your x minus m, the position and the balance of trade, originally was at equilibrium. This fall in x minus m will lead to a deficit. All right, and then from here, you talk about how your current account deficit leads, your balance of trade deficit will lead to a current account deficit. Okay, and that's your answer. So in your introduction for this question, very straightforward, you just talk about what your current account is, which was what we did just now. All right, so we talk about goods and services, we talk about income, we talk about unilateral transfers. So what does it mean to have a current account deficit? There's a net outflow of currency. Okay, so as balance of trade accounts for the largest proportion of our current account balance, deficit is normally arising because of your trade deficit. So what can cause a current account deficit? So stronger economic growth in the domestic country. So just now this part here, the relative income, the part that I mentioned, higher purchasing power, increasing ability to purchase your imported goods and services. So M will increase. This will result in the trade deficit, the current account deficit that we see. Any questions? So this is the first factor. All right, then this one is just the example. USA due to stronger economic growth. All right. So you don't just give the theory. Down here you can see the examples that is given, contextualized. They gave the US example. Because you say incomes increase. So after the 2008 financial crisis, as the US recover, higher national income has actually allowed your households to purchase more imported goods and services. So this actually resulted in the current account deficit, substantial trade deficit with China. And then the other part, I think you mentioned about appreciation. So appreciation here caused the current account deficit. All right, so just now we mentioned about price of exports in terms of foreign currency to rise, imports in terms of domestic currency to fall. All right, so they'll buy less, buy more. All right, so this one is your Marshall learner. Okay. Any question for this? Then the third point is our first point, the higher domestic inflation rate. All right, so this causes domestic households to reduce quantity demanded for domestic goods. Substitute them with the relatively cheaper imported goods. So demand for imported goods will rise. Foreigners will decrease the quantity demanded for countries' exports because these exports are more expensive. So your X will decrease. Your M here will increase. So that's how we explain. All right, last one, I don't think you all actually talk about it, which is your comparative advantage. All right, I think in trade, you learn this thing about comparative advantage, the ability to produce your goods and services with a lower up cost relative to other countries. So the fact that you can produce it with a lower up cost suggests that you have comparative advantage. All right, but this comparative advantage is what we term as a dynamic concept. dynamic here suggesting that it changes across time. So you may have comparative advantage in the production of, let's say, steel, S-T-E-E-L, steel, all right, for this period. But it doesn't mean that maybe 2 years or 3 years down the road, you will still have this comparative advantage. Because over the period of time, some other countries may actually see their op cost decreasing. All right, and when that actually happens, you see this loss of comparative advantage, whereby instead of you having a lower op cost, another country might actually have a lower op cost. Okay, op cost is your opportunity cost. So this one I think we'll elaborate more when we talk about trade and globalization. I think most of you are not studying for this anyway. All right, this comparative advantage is under your trade and globalization. You're not going to study this for your DT2. And being practical, I don't think I want to spend too much time on this because you are not going to look at this as much. So I'll talk about this in future, okay? So down here, conclusion, basically the 3 points that we've mentioned, that we discussed, those are the reasons for the current account deficit. Okay? So please make sure you understand what can cause the deficit, not just on current account, but also on your capital financial account, because they could always ask you a question on that. All right, so with that, I give you a 3-minute break. 10:53, I will resume with part B. All right, part B is about policy lah. Oh, okay, time's up, 10:53. Can I have your attention back? All right, now I'm going to look at your question B. Discuss appropriateness of the measures a government could adopt to alleviate this current account deficit. So the current account deficit, you earlier remember, is your X minus M being negative in value, correct? And if you look at the policies or the measures, it's already stated in your preamble. So you are going to make use of this. So what are they? They are your tariffs, your type FP, your supply side policy. Okay, So I just want to take you back to your lecture notes. Okay, when you learn policies for this, what are the policies that you can use to address a deficit in your, let's say, your BOP deficit? What are the various policies? How are they classified? There's not expansionary. Then the expansionary. You think you want to expand? Okay. One is expenditure reducing. The other category is expenditure switching. Okay, let's understand deeper why. Why is it that we want to get them to expenditure reduce or expenditure switch? Okay, what's one of the reason as to why there's a balance of payment, why there's a current account deficit? So expenditure reducing, let's try to understand this part here. One is expenditure reducing, one is expenditure switching. Why is there a need for us to reduce the expenditure? Why is there a need for us to reduce to switch your expenditure? Why? Sorry? Import more. We want to import more or you don't import more? So, okay, if you remember, one of the factors that we mentioned here was about incomes. Right? We were talking about incomes. We were talking about your economic growth. Okay, y'all turn on your, y'all can close. Okay, all right. So earlier we identified one of the factors here that caused the current account deficit, and one of it was because of higher economic, not say higher, economic growth in your country or higher incomes. Correct? You remember that we mentioned that higher incomes here, because of the higher purchasing power, you buy more imports. All right, and because of this increased expenditure on imports, your X minus M might actually move to negative. Assume ceteris paribus lah. Assuming X stays the same, your M increase, the extent of this increase actually greater than your X, such that it becomes negative mah. So why do we want to then reduce expenditure? Is so as to address this part. Because as we reduce the expenditure, we buy less imports. That's the intent. But of course, on hindsight, when you actually reduce expenditure, what will happen? What's one limitation or what's one concern about this? How do I reduce expenditure? Huh? Expensive? How do I reduce expenditure? What kind of policies do I use? Contractionary, fiscal, if not your monetary policy. So what is one limitation of doing this? My incomes might actually fall. All right. So there's a give and a take. All right. If your concern here is really about this current account deficit, then please go ahead and use this expenditure reducing policy. Because you do need to also understand that while you try to do this expenditure reducing policy, what comes along with it is a contractionary effect that it will bring to your economy. And what happens when there's a contractionary effect on the economy? Your incomes reduce. Your income level will reduce. Or it will slower the extent of the increase, depending on how you want to position it. Understand what I mean? So that's definitely one limitation that you want to pick up and you want to highlight. Okay? So this part here is actually tying in with this portion here, expenditure reducing. Okay, when we talk about expenditure switching, why is there a need for us to switch expenditure? What do we mean by expenditure switching? That means getting your domestic consumers to buy less imports. So you probably want to perhaps consider the use of tariffs, because when you impose tariffs, what happens? Imported goods become more expensive. All right, and if you compare to domestically produced goods, it might become domestically produced goods might become more attractive, cheaper. That's the intent. Okay. Or also you can look at supply side policy. How do I use supply side policy to do this? How do I use supply side policy to do this expenditure switching part? Supply side policy will help to lower COP, right? Not because you increase productivity, lower COP, you lower your unit cost of production, and when your unit cost of production is actually lowered, assuming your producers are able to pass on cost savings in terms of lower prices, domestically produced goods will now become cheaper, and it will become more attractive for your domestic consumers. Likewise, also for your foreigners who if your cost of production is now cheaper, your price is cheaper, they might choose to buy more of your exports. This is if we talk about cost of production. There's another way to explain this. How? If let's say I'm not so much affected by the price of the good, I'm more affected by the quality of the good. Because my supply side policy is not just about lowering costs. What's the other effect of supply side policy? It increases quality of your workers, of your labor. With this increased quality of labor, with the higher skills, etc., they are then able to produce better quality goods and services. All right, our supply side policy here could be subsidies that are given to your companies, to especially your export companies, to actually do R&D, to do research and development, so that they can come out with better products. So these better quality products will now attract more domestic consumers, likewise foreign consumers as well. So it's not just about pricing, it's also about in terms of quality. Understand how this works? So that's the real intent as to the two category of your policies that we use to address your deficit. All right. But of course, question here, what's the question? What's the essence of the question? Question wants you to look at appropriateness. It's not just about, oh, policy is effective in doing this. Policy is effective in doing that. It's not just about effectiveness at all. Question here is all about appropriateness. So what does that require us to do on top of doing what we did and what we said earlier? When it comes to appropriateness, what else do we need to do? What do we need to do? We probably want to apply to the various contexts. Because certain policies may be appropriate in certain contexts, less appropriate in some other contexts. So perhaps you want to make use of some examples. All right, or you could also look at it in terms of maybe unintended consequences. Tariffs, will we really want to use tariffs? Because appropriateness, but is it appropriate? Yes, it does help to address this. It is effective in addressing your deficit. But do you see it as appropriate or not? That's another question altogether. Because if you just use it for short-term basis, that's something that we tell you is okay lah. But if you're gonna depend on it long-term, or then you better not do it because there are implications, there are consequences. All right. Like for example, the recent US-China trade war, the use of the tariffs, all right, on US part, and then now China China mentioned that they wanted to retaliate, and then now it's not just that; it has actually expanded further to include your Chinese companies, all right, and all the discussion here and there, lah. All right, such that your global economy are feeling the effects of this rather unnecessary, because it's really not necessary, lah. All right. Policy that the US tried to do. So is it really going to do any good? Will there be any good coming out of it or not? That's really something that you also want to consider because this question here is all about appropriateness. All right, just now the type FP we mentioned. All right, if your economy is facing a recession together with a deficit, will you still recommend contractionary fiscal, contractionary monetary? Then you're doing your country, your economy in because yes, it helps to address your deficit lah. But what comes along with it is that you fall further into recession. So that's why you need to prioritize lah. Because there are 4 macro goals. We know we can't achieve all 4 at the same time. This is what you can use in your evaluation lah. We know we cannot achieve all 4 at the same time. So it's really down to prioritizing what is the problem. So most economies may have 2, may have 3, or even all 4 problems all at one time. But you cannot just say, oh, I want to achieve all 4 goals all at once. You probably want to prioritize. Perhaps out of all these 4 goals, maybe I see economic growth as the one that can help me to get me out of problem first before I talk about the other goals. So then maybe I'll prioritize that as my first goal. Then I'll use policies to align that. All the others, I can adopt a wait and see kind of mentality or mindset. So that's something that you also can consider. All right, supply side policy, of course, this one is also, it takes time. Time is the problem here, right? So is it appropriate or not? If a country has an urgent it has been having a deficit for a prolonged period of time, and you want a remedy, you want a solution as quickly as possible, then this may not be very appropriate in this context. So depending on how you go about, you address them accordingly lah, like what I just mentioned. So that's essentially how we address this question B. Okay, so question B here, they mentioned about the various policy lah. Okay, they talk about contractionary fiscal, they talk about exchange lah, they talk about protectionism lah, they talk about supply side. But do you need all 4? Not necessary lah. Okay. So appropriateness, appropriateness. Okay. Take note of the criteria. Appropriateness depends on root cause. Is the policy appropriate or not? Really depends on whether it targets the root cause or not. The economic condition, just now I mentioned, if the economy is in recession, all right, together with that, the deficit, would that then be a good combination such that you use this policy? The nature of the economy, the level and the duration of the deficit. Remember, if the duration is for a prolonged period of time, then perhaps supply side policy is something you will still adopt, but you still want something in the short term to try to improve the situation, and of course possible trade-offs. Give and take part that I mentioned earlier. All right, especially when we talk about contractionary policy. Yes, you achieve a more improved BOT, BOP, or whatever position, but at the same time, you also get the contractual effect. Your incomes are reduced, etc. All right, so down here, you will still talk about the policies as it is and talk about how it helps. So down here is the contractionary part. So with lower income, lower induced consumption, and there will be lower demand for imports lah. So import expenditure will decrease. So now is it appropriate or not? Okay, for countries like US, strong downward multiplier, so it's okay. All right, so this is due to government providing for more, so countries will be able to reduce this. However, depending on the state of economy, they may conflict in goals. If it's operating below full employment, may result in a rise in unemployment. Fall in AD that comes along with it may fuel business pessimism, induce firms to further cut down on investment, thereby reducing current output and employment, reducing your potential economic growth. Those points that we mentioned, the ones that you have to let go lah because of the use of contractionary policy. All right, so this is effective only if they were actually experiencing inflationary pressure. So if you have inflationary pressure that is largely due to demand pull, and you have this balance of trade deficit, then by doing this, this will help achieve both a price stability as well as an improved deficit position. All right. Some of you may choose to use exchange rate. Right, some of you may choose to use exchange rate. It's also okay. Down here is depreciation. Because earlier we mentioned one problem is the appreciation of our currency that led to the deficit that we mentioned. So we want to depreciate the currency. Again, this one depends on the nature of economy. All right. For economies like Singapore, what happens when we depreciate? We bring about cost push inflation. So this one may result in Singapore's context. The currency depreciation may result in cost push. So it really depends on the nature of whether is it appropriate or not. All right, it's also appropriate if they have spare capacity lah. Okay, because depreciation here will increase your AD, and when your AD increase, this will help to increase your RNY, your output, etc. But what's one problem with this? When your income increase, you buy more import expenditure again. Because when you depreciate, your exports become relatively cheaper, imports become more expensive. Your RNY increase. Remember your AD, because your AD increase, X minus M increase. So one effect of this is that your import expenditure will increase. So is it really appropriate or not? That's another question. Okay. Okay, and depreciation might lead to capital flight lah, if they expect further depreciation. All right, this part here is on tariff protectionism. Tariff diagram, I think you all haven't learned, right? Yeah, so I skip this. I move on to supply side. So government can provide grants, subsidies, or tax incentives to encourage innovation, investment in research and development. So all this will help to improve quality of your product lah, thereby increasing the demand. With better methods or processes, they are also able to improve productivity, lowering your cost of production. So it's an improvement in both cost of production as well as improvement in terms of quality. So lower prices, improve quality, and this will help to improve and increase your export revenue and improve your balance of trade and hence the current account deficit. All right, more effective if root cause here is lack of competitiveness lah, but it takes time. So having said all that we have said, this is the evaluation. So really depends on economic condition, the state and the nature of economy. All right, if it's due to demand pull inflation, then expenditure reducing policies here, because they reduce AD, this will be very appropriate. If the root cause is lack of export competitiveness, then perhaps supply side policy will be better instead of your tariffs. Also depends on the state. If it's below full employment, deliberate currency depreciation may be more appropriate. That relies heavily on external demand, exchange rate and supply side policies will be more appropriate, as in the case of Singapore. All right. However, if external economic conditions are not so positive, overall effectiveness may be limited. Because if it's a global recession that's happening, even if you make your product cheaper, even if you depreciate your currency, your exports are relatively cheaper in foreign currency, even if you improve quality of product and so on and so forth, they are not going to buy. They are not going to buy as much still. So that is another thing to consider as well. Ken, any questions? Anything? No? Okay. Okay, then I will end the tutorial for today.